Well, there's much to talk about. Let's get to our panel. Joining us here in Washington is John Glaser. He focuses on foreign policy with the Cato Institute. Sahar Aziz is a law professor at Rutgers University. She joins us from New York. And Peter Vincent is a former counterterrorism official with the Department of Homeland Security and the U.S. Justice Department. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Peter, let me start with you. You've been involved in counterterrorism efforts, both at the Justice Department and the Department of Homeland Security. 16 years after the 9/11 attacks, what is your assessment of what became known as the war on terror? Is this country now safer?
I do believe the United States is safer, but it's not and will never be entirely free of conflict and of terrorism. I actually, in my capacity at the Department of Homeland Security, had the opportunity to travel on 2 separate occasions to Afghanistan and met with our counterparts, officials, military and law enforcement intelligence gathering officials there. And they reminded me, in all seriousness, that the name for Afghanistan, the graveyard of empires, should be taken seriously. And now we see a very still strong Taliban. We see a resurgent al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. We see a still clever and very dangerous Haqqani network. And we see continued strength being exhibited by the so-called or self-proclaimed Islamic State. So great efforts have been made to try to make the world and try to make Afghanistan safer, but we still have a lot of work to do.
The thing is, Peter, that this war on terror has led to conventional wars. There's wars against Iraq, the invasion of Afghanistan. It's led to changes in the United States here. You have the no-fly lists. You've got the proposed Muslim immigration ban. We've just heard about that now. Did this war actually make things worse?
Some have argued that we have let that pendulum swing too far and that we have traded a bit of our own liberty, our civil rights, for some modicum of greater security.
Right.
I do believe that the effort in Afghanistan is a righteous one. One, perhaps most importantly, for the Afghan people, and 2, to prevent groups from using Afghanistan, as al-Qaeda did previously, as a sort of haven to engage in operational planning and, in fact, to launch attacks against the West and the United States.
Yeah, I want to talk a bit more about what you talked about, the United States giving up some of its rights with Sahar Aziz. Let's bring her in from New York. Sahar, when we look at this war that the U.S. has pursued against terrorists, it has asked its citizens to give up cherished rights, civil rights, human rights, freedoms. This is the era now that we live in of mass surveillance, of no-fly lists, as I mentioned. We've had imprisonment without trial, Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib. Hasn't this damaged the United States' reputation and image around the world?
Well, it certainly made it much more difficult for the United States to criticize and attempt to stop human rights violations by foreign countries. I mean, as we speak now, there is arguably a genocide going on against Muslims in Burma. And it's very difficult for the United States to put pressure on these foreign governments, many of whom are dictators and authoritarians, when we ourselves are being accused and there's evidence that we violated international human rights law. The other issue that I have with regard to whether we're safer or not, or the question that's important, is have we effectively decreased the root causes of the threats to our country? And to the extent that the causes and the root causes are abroad, which I think they are in conflict zones such as Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, parts of Somalia, parts of Yemen, is we continue to deal with symptoms, and in our definition of prevention is very superficial, where we're simply trying to prevent the spread of the violence on U.S. soil, as opposed to trying to resolve in a long-term manner with sustainable solutions the very conflicts that sprout out terrorism. So I fear that all of the waiving of civil rights and civil liberties, which we shouldn't do for many reasons, is not even providing the utilitarian benefit of making the threats decrease.
Okay, I want to get back to the causes of terrorism, but John, let me ask you first, what is your view? Has the war on terrorism been successful?
It's been a complete failure, actually. In terms of our foreign policy, it hasn't made us safer. It's actually exacerbated the terrorism problem. In the 7 countries that we either invaded or bombed in the global war on terror post 9/11, terrorism increased in those countries. It's true that we haven't had a terrorist attack like 9/11 again here at home, but that's because the threat of terror has always been pretty low. Actually, if you boil down the fundamental problem with our approach post 9/11 to the problem of terrorism is threat inflation. we've massively exaggerated the actual threat that terrorism poses.
Why? Why?
Well, I think there are political reasons why. Politicians are particularly scared of having an event happen and being blamed for not being prepared for it. There's also a tendency for powerful leaders to demonstrate that they take the threat seriously by taking military action, even if it doesn't actually solve the problem. But you know, the threat of terror is a manageable problem. It's not a war to be won. And the application of military force isn't all that effective in solving it. It's really a law enforcement and intelligence issue. And you know, if you bracket 9/11, the number of people, the number of Americans that have been killed by terrorism since 1968 is about 1,000. 1,000 people over 50 years is not something that we need to spend trillions of dollars in foreign policy adventures, hundreds of billions of dollars in protection here at home through the curtailment of civil liberties and security theater at airports and so on. So I think we've taken the wrong approach basically from the beginning.
The thing is, it's still a priority for most Americans, because if you look at one of the surveys that was taken right after the 9/11 attacks, Americans were asked whether there could be another attack, and about 41% said yes.
Yeah.
Then that number went down to single digits over the years, but recently it's come back. In fact, it's even more now. 48% of people think, yes, there could be another attack.
Yeah, so I don't think it's wise for politicians to follow the people into hysteria. I think what's important is for leaders to be responsible and have the obligation of explaining to people the facts, which are that terrorism is a low probability threat in America, and it's not, and the costs, which are, again, trillions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of lives, both in the Middle East and thousands of U.S. soldiers that have sacrificed their lives in foreign wars that were essentially elective. This is not an appropriate cost compared to the threat.
Peter, getting back to a point that Sahar raised, and that is the causes of terrorism. When the Department of Defense or the Department of Homeland Security formulates its policy on how to counter terrorism, do they ever look at what causes terrorism?
Absolutely, and I agree with Sahar completely that the United States and its NATO and Western allies have not done enough to address the root causes, including individuals in countries across the globe that are feeling marginalized and alienated and disaffected and dissatisfied. There has been a long-going debate in Afghanistan in particular as to what approach to take a counter-insurgency approach, an effort to win the hearts and minds and to provide not just security and safety, but justice and jobs as well, on the one hand, and what apparently President Trump is attempting to do in Afghanistan now by the provision of about 4,000 additional troops, mostly paratroopers and some air cover, that is counterterrorism, affecting only or attacking only terrorists themselves and not taking into account the need to provide for a safe and secure community in those countries where we are operating.
How much of this is ideologically driven? Because if we look at some of the recent attacks in Europe, they were carried out by criminals, drug dealers, who are known to the police.
Absolutely. Part of the challenge that we have is that nation states, for the most part, follow rules and laws and respect sovereignty and borders. Unfortunately, criminals and terrorists, obviously, don't have those sorts of restrictions, either legally or through regulations, let alone based on their own warped view of their moral compasses. So the real challenge has been working together with our allies in an effort to address issues in their own countries.
Right.
One thing that I think is pretty obvious, at least to me and the colleagues that I have in this national security area with whom I still work, is that things like the Muslim ban, the travel ban, are completely ineffective and deeply insulting to individuals of the Muslim faith. And in fact, it's deeply counterproductive and deeply insulting to the very countries and their citizens that we are working with on a day-to-day basis to help work together to combat the scourge of terrorism globally. So we do ourselves no favors by insulting an entire faith or entire regions or countries when we need so desperately to work with those individuals to address the issue that is in fact killing. The vast majority of the victims are, of course, Muslims in places like Afghanistan and across the globe.
Yeah. Sahar, what is your view on that? I mean, there is the view that a lot of the militancy that has emerged in the last few years among young Muslim men mainly was caused by the United States, by the wars that the United States started in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. There's a U.S. historian, Andrew Basovich, who pointed out that since 1980, the United States has bombed, invaded, or occupied 14 Muslim countries. What's the connection there?
I think most international terrorism, if not all, is based or grounded in local grievances. And as many of us who study the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia know, there has been many conflicts there that were started with the revolutionary movements to eliminate colonial powers, and then battles between those who won the revolution and who would succeed them. And unfortunately, the United States foreign policy has been quite misguided in terms of taking sides that tend to be very repressive towards the local population, which then makes the West, and the United States in particular, the so-called far enemy that supports the so-called near enemy. And so we need to understand that our foreign policy entangles us in the conflicts that are local or national in nature because of the fact that we give military aid, we give political support, we give economic aid to ruthless dictators. Or, at best, we turn a blind eye and say nothing and don't restrain them in any way, notwithstanding that we have significant global power, both economically and politically, through international organizations and the like. And so when those persons have grievances and they essentially mobilize into non-state actors that do engage in violence to fight state violence, they see the United States and Europe as actors in that conflict, even if they may be behind the scenes, so to speak. So I think with regard to changing our foreign policy, we need to be much smarter about how we're going to intervene, if we're going to intervene at all, and understand that when we support dictatorships who repress their people, their citizens in the Middle East, the citizens see us as repressors as well, and that's where they use various ideologies, whether it's religious. In the 60s and the 70s, it was more nationalist, socialist, or Arab nationalism, for example. But they will find an ideology to justify what they think is a just cause for freedom and justice.
Peter, this is not rocket science, the fact that people in those countries see the United States as Sahar pointed out, the repressors as well. Why isn't that recognized here?
I think it is recognized. And I think that there are people in policymaking positions in the United States and in other countries, obviously, that have attempted to understand this, as Sahar has and as John has studied. But it's such a complicated dynamic. Afghanistan itself is such a complicated dynamic, given the tribal alliances and the history there, that attempting to address grievances at a local level, the vast majority of which may have been caused, as Ira points out, by individuals, autocrats in those countries, is something that's very difficult for the United States to become involved in. If I could just go back to one thing and to disagree with my colleague John on one point, I don't think that the so-called war on terror has been a complete and utter failure. I think there are examples of disruption of terrorist cells and networks in places like Afghanistan and Iraq and frankly the United States that show that we have been able to disrupt and frustrate terrorist activity. I do agree with John on many things, including that I don't think we're doing it enough and I don't think we're doing it smartly. And the one thing that John said that really resonated with me is that we need our national leaders, our policymakers, to be courageous and to not fall into the trap of, as John eloquently puts, following the people, following the individual's fear, but standing up and strong, standing up and saying, you know, we need to work on this together, but demonizing an entire religion or an entire region is not helpful.
But isn't that exploited politically? Because what people hear from politicians is, if you mention those realities that you were talking about, the other side, the opposition, would say, well, that guy's weak on terrorism.
Yeah, that's certainly something that will be said, no doubt. But we need leaders and policymakers to try to avoid feeling like they need to then cave into those and to sort of put on a strong face. We need them to make very strong public statements and to work with their colleagues and not to let fear drive the policymaking.
You know, to that very point, Obama actually did, during his presidency, try to do this. There were several speeches that he made where he tried to tamp down on the inflated threat of terrorism. He explained that Americans are not at risk of getting bombed or attacked or whatever. He tried to sort of take a more sober approach, and he didn't face any political consequences for it. And so that, I think, should be a signal to political leaders that you can, in fact, be reasonable and sober-minded and prudent with regard to the hysteria over terrorism and not lose votes and not take a big political hit.
But didn't he also expand the drone attacks?
He did, yes. His policies are sometimes different from his rhetoric, as with most politicians. I mean, the previous discussion we had about, you know, the causes of terrorism and the support for dictatorial regimes in the region is completely true, but it probably understates the case. We bombed Iraq for every year in the past 26 years, since the Gulf War, because throughout the 90s we had a no-fly zone where we occasionally bombed. In every year since 1991, we have bombed Iraq. Not to mention a massive sanctions regime, which was essentially a blockade, which the UN estimated probably killed close to 1 million people. So the grievances are very real, and if you've been doing something for a quarter of a century to no greater effect, it's time to start asking why we're doing it in the first place.
So, John, the stated aim of the war on terror shortly after the 9/11 attacks was that that war was meant to degrade, disrupt terrorist networks on the one hand, and on the other hand, to deter those groups from carrying out any more attacks against the United States. Has that succeeded?
Well, again, we're talking about a threat that is really minor to begin with, and so you do all these ostentatious military operations, and it's easy to say, well, causation is correlation, but I don't think that's the case. As I said, in the 7 countries that we either invaded or bombed post 9/11, the rate and incidence of terrorism in those countries increased massively. In 2006, the U.S. intelligence community released a national intelligence report which said that Iraq was becoming a cause célèbre for the global jihadist movement. And all these Muslims, extremist Muslims, were flooding to Iraq in order to make that their kind of stage to engage in terrorist acts and goad the United States into staying longer and so on. So, you know, foreign policy-wise, it's been an utter failure. I will grant you that there have been some things that measures we've taken on the law enforcement angle and the intelligence angle that have been proper and effective. But with regard to foreign policy and the approach we've taken militaristically towards the Middle East, I think it's been an utter failure.
Peter, what about the terror threat domestically in the United States since 9/11? I mean, there have been attacks, yeah? We had the Boston Marathon attack, San Bernardino, the Fort Hood attacks in Texas as well. To what extent has the United States been successful in stopping attacks here?
I think the United States has been somewhat successful, but obviously the examples that you've just enumerated are reasons to believe that we have much work to be done.
Okay.
I'll also point out that Charlottesville, where white supremacists engaged in what appears to be an act of terror by using a car to kill a counter-protester there, is something that should trouble us all. The Department of Homeland Security in the Trump administration very early on made the conscientious decision to stop focusing on all sorts of terrorism and all sorts of domestic threats and to focus only on what the president terms radical Islamic terrorism. That's a problem. The past 10 years, 70% of all killings related to domestic terrorism have been caused by white supremacists.
Right. Sahar, I want to ask you about, you're the legal expert, about the legal impact this war on terror has had inside the United States. The news website, The Intercept, published a series of articles on this called Trial and Terror. And it's pointed out that the US government has prosecuted more than 800 people for terrorism since the 9/11 attacks. Most have never committed an act of violence. The Intercept points out that the FBI's primary tool has been a policy of preemption. In many instances, it sets up these attacks, goads people, persuades them into this, and then the next thing they know, they're arrested and serving life in prison. Is that not entrapment? I mean, has that not distorted American justice?
Well, first, I just want to respond to something with regard to the international context, and I'll move to the domestic.
Yeah.
I just want to highlight that the United States' failure to support the Arab Spring that essentially turned into an Arab nightmare for most Arab citizens was the biggest foreign policy disaster, in my opinion, vis-a-vis the Middle East, because the message that it sent to people in the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia is that the United States prefers to work with dictators who produce violent non-state actors rather than to side with non-violent populist movements seeking indigenous democracy. So I just want to highlight that because the people in that region see that and understand it. And so when we, our foreign policy or our policymakers state that they are concerned with security, concerned with safety, concerned with national security of the U.S. or abroad, they really have very little credibility. I'll shift it now to the domestic context. So with regard to entrapment, it's very difficult to prove entrapment. It's what we call an affirmative defense, which means the burden of proof is on the defendant to show that the government effectively took someone who didn't have the predisposition to commit a crime and produce the disposition and the opportunity, as opposed to just the opportunity. The government agents are very well trained in what entrapment means, and they're very savvy in ensuring that they get the evidence through usually recordings or some other evidence to show that the individual, the purported defendant, was already predisposed to commit the act of violence, and that all they did is provide them with the opportunity. So it's been an unsuccessful defense in court. But with regard to these prosecutions, essentially what they are sting operations, which has been used in other contexts like gangs and drugs and guns. But this is much more problematic for many reasons. One is they tend to target people based on their religious identity, even though they will not admit that. Most of the targets of these sting operations are people who identify as Muslim. Second is it's very grounded in religious ideology. So they tend to look at orthodox religious practices as proxies for suspicious behavior. And that's how they may find someone to decide if they're going to target. And third, much of it is done online because studies have shown that much of the recruitment by bona fide international terrorist groups is happening online through chat rooms, encrypted communications, and so on. And so they've started to troll Facebook and Twitter and chat rooms looking for prey, they meaning the law enforcement individuals. So young Muslim men who may have some mental health problems, who may be facing a personal crisis, or who may just have a big mouth and say a lot of things they probably shouldn't say, but it's completely legal to say, find themselves ensnared in this web by very sophisticated law enforcement recruiters who are trying to recruit them into a sting operation. And I realize that sounds very cynical, but the cases are showing over and over again that these are individuals who are at the margins of society.
Okay, very quickly, John, we've got 30 seconds.
I want to make two quick points if I can. So I agree with her on the sting operations, but we should also probably look at budgetary stuff. The FBI and other groups that are doing these sting operations have a lot of incentive to demonstrate that they're doing a good job, and so to maintain high budgets. The other quick point, and I have to push back against my colleague, the United States should not be in the business of intervening in the Middle East for the sake of democratic revolutions. That is a recipe for entangling us in all the kinds of wars that we don't want to get into and that actually anger the Muslim populations in general. We experienced this in Libya, and the result was anarchy post-Gaddafi government, the rise of militant groups in Libya that weren't there before. It's a bad approach. We should not be on the side of democracy or on the side of dictatorship. We should stay out of their business.
I think that is an entire new show that you're talking about there. Thanks to all of you for being with us.